So let's talk about affirmative action. So there are different kinds of arguments about affirmative action. One of them is a legal argument about whether or not the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees the equal protection of the laws to all citizens, is consistent with the practice of using the racial identity of individuals as a factor in treating them in terms of the allocation of resources, and opportunities, admissions to colleges, employment, government contracts, and so on. Is it ipso facto unconstitutional to use race in public decision-making that benefits blacks and Latinos and women and so on? So that's one kind of question about affirmative action. Another kind of question about affirmative action is it leading to outcomes, bracketing for a moment the constitutional issue, assuming for a moment that there isn't any sort of trump card, there isn't any killer argument that negates affirmative action a priori. Saying that it's okay to do it, the question is it wise to do it? So I want to discuss affirmative action in that manner. I actually am very much influenced by a book by the legal scholar Randall Kennedy at Harvard. The book is called For Discrimination. For Discrimination. And what Randy argues in that book is, yes, affirmative action is racial discrimination. Now, it might be strange to think that that's something that has to be argued for, but a lot of people deny that racial discrimination is going on. It's not discrimination if we're using a policy in order to try to rectify the effects of past discrimination. But I think Randall is right to observe that, if a university is using the race of applicants as part of how it's making its decisions, if a government agency is using the race of potential vendors as part of how it determines whether or not to let a contract, an employer is using the race of applicants as part of the calculation about whether or not to offer a job, that employer, to the extent that they're making use of race as a factor, is engaged in racial discrimination. So Randy says it's racial discrimination, but Professor Kennedy says it's not racial discrimination that's inconsistent with the 14th Amendment. How perverse would it be to interpret that amendment enacted with the express intent of ensuring the equal citizenship of African Americans? How perverse would it be to interpret it as enjoining a state actor from what would otherwise be thought of as reasonable and moderate use of race with the purpose of trying to reverse the consequences of historic racial discrimination? That would be perverse, says Kennedy, and I tend to agree with that. So I'm not one of those who would respond to affirmative action by saying it's discrimination against non-black or non-Latino people and therefore it's wrong and it must not be done. It is discrimination to the extent that it's undertaken to benefit blacks or Latino, but it's not discrimination I think should be prevented on a constitutional argument. So that's one thing that I would say. But we are here in the year 2019. Affirmative action is something that dates back to the late 1960s and really gets going in the 1970s. President Lyndon Johnson famously says, I believe it's in a commencement address at Howard University in 1965, you don't take someone who's been hobbled by history, the chains that encumber them, and bring them up to, you remove the chain, you bring them up to the starting line of a race, and then you set the race off and expect that you're being entirely fair. This is a paraphrase of Johnson. What he says is, we need equality as a fact and equality as an outcome, not merely equality in principle or equality as a theory, says Johnson. So we're a half century in to this idea that we got to do something special for the blacks in the competitive venues where they lag behind in order to ensure equality of opportunity. A half century, that's a long time. It's as long from Johnson giving that speech in 1965 to where we sit right here today in 2019, as was the time that expired between Appomattox, where Lee surrenders to Grant, and Versailles, where the First World War is brought to a conclusion. That's a long time. That's 3 generations. It's a long, long time. So what I've been saying about affirmative action of late is I don't want to argue with you about whether or not it's appropriate or just or whatever. I just want to get you to think about the fact that we're now well along the way to institutionalizing as a permanent manner of how we do business, how we admit people to elite colleges, how we decide who's going to be on the faculty of a university, how we decide to think about the allocation of business opportunities when the state goes out and spends billions of dollars building highways or purchasing materials or whatever. We're now well along the way to institutionalizing as a permanent practice, using a special set of considerations when evaluating African American aspirants and putting a thumb on the scale on their behalf. Now, here's what I want to say about that. It's not equality. It certainly is a distribution of benefits in the direction of African Americans. That it is. It's a benefit to some African Americans to be able to enjoy opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise enjoy because of affirmative action. But if the goal is racial equality, baking into the cake the practice of treating blacks specially in virtue of their blackness, people born in the year 2005 is not equality. I'm a college professor, we're on a college campus. So the question of affirmative action in higher education is a natural one to contemplate. I'm not sure what goes on here, but at Brown we get over 35,000 applications a year and we admit about 1,800 people. That's a pretty selective operation that we're engaged in. We're an elite institution. Average SAT score is, I'm sure it's over 1,400, combined math and verbal. It's an elite enterprise. Do we really want to build into our policy going forward forever the idea that blacks simply can't be judged by the same standard with respect to this kind of undertaking? If indeed it's the case that African American applicants to a place like Brown University are on the whole not competitive, the numbers would be 3% or 4% instead of 12% or 13% if you did not take race into account when you made the decision about whom to admit. If indeed that's the case, do you think that you're going to get to equality by institutionalizing the practice of lowering the bar? Oh, she's black. She's got an 1150, but that's okay. She's black. Do you really think that that's going to get you to equality? It is not. As a remedial enterprise undertaken in a transitional way with the intent of directly addressing historical inequity and trying to get on a different track than what had been, say the year is 1975, okay, I can see that. As a permanent practice, as the way of doing business, as in effect, compensatory endowment to people of color, so that they can be represented in numbers that don't actually reveal the disparity in their performances. It's a lot of things, but it's not equality. It leads to a lot of things that are not healthy, like patronization. We don't really expect the soft bigotry, low expectations. We don't really expect our African American students are presumptively disadvantaged. Think about that. You're black and you're presumptively disadvantaged in virtue of being black? We need diversity. We need representation. Oh, I see. Now the African Americans who are included in this rat race competition to get into these places. Everybody in this room knows what I'm talking about. You apply to 20 colleges because you don't know whether you're going to get into one of them or not. We create a world in which the presence of African Americans is justified because they leaven the mix, because they bring some color to the table. It's a lot of things, but it's not equality. So what I've been saying of late about this question is, okay, you want to do affirmative action, go ahead. I mean, I'm not going to fall on my sword about it. Me personally, I'm not going to throw a fit. No, it's not the same thing as racial discrimination against blacks in the history and so forth and so on. You go ahead and do it if you want to do it. But if you really want equality, you wouldn't be satisfied with that. If you really want equality, you would address yourself to the foundational root of why it is that African Americans as a population are underrepresented at the right tail of the distribution of intellectual and academic performance. Unless you do that, unless you change that foundational root, you'll never get equality. So you decide. You want representation or you want equality? You want titular representation? You want a cover story? Or you want equality? Are you interested in developing the human potential of the African American population? Or are you merely interested in covering your ass by being able to present an optics that shows that you're a diverse and inclusive institution? Okay. So no, I'm not against affirmative action, but I'm against hypocrisy. I'm against condescension. Okay? And I'm asking people to imagine what kind of country we're going to be in. Really? We're going to do this for another 30 years? We're going to do this for another 50 years? This is where we're going to be? It's, in my mind, unacceptable vision for our country, that we're going to depend upon treating black people differently because everybody knows they can't cut it. Unacceptable. So, I mean, this controversy about the exam schools in New York City, you know, yeah. Brooklyn Tech, Bronx Science, Stuyvesant. So they have an exam, they give the exam, tens upon tens of thousands of people take it, they're admitting hundreds. Stuyvesant constitutes a class, incoming class for the fall of next year. I think it's 895 admits. 7 of them are black. And the newspaper article says, in the spirit of affirmative action, racial segregation returns to New York City's high schools, right? The presumption is the low number of African Americans being admitted is a reflection of the failure of the institution to be fair and open to all people. It is not. It's a reflection of something else, something less pretty, something much more challenging, something much more profoundly going to the heart of what's wrong in our country. It's a reflection of the failure to develop the human potential of those youngsters who happen to be black. The test is only a messenger. It's merely telling us what people know and what they don't know. Let's get rid of the test. Let's put a quota on the schools. Let's raise those numbers. Not. Let's develop those people so that they can compete. I saw some statistics the other day about Brooklyn Tech, where over 60% of the students are Asian, that more than half of them are also disadvantaged in the sense that they qualify for public benefit. They're not rich middle-class kids on the whole who are floating into Brooklyn Tech because their parents bought a test prep course for them. There are youngsters, many of whom are disadvantaged, who are developing their capacity to function in the high-tech world that we live in the 21st century. The low numbers of African Americans who are exhibiting that degree of excellence is a warning sign, not about whether or not Brooklyn Tech or New York public schools are racist, but whether or not our society is developing the human potential of all of its people. Now, we could go into the reasons why, and they will be many, and the fault will not fall only on white people. We can talk about why our youngsters are not performing better. Yes, they deserve to have better schools, and maybe they deserve to have different parenting. And maybe the culture is to some degree to be faulted. And I know I'm not supposed to say that. But what I can see is huge differences across racial groups in their ability to function within American society. And what I can tell you is nobody is coming to save our black youngsters from the loss of developing their human potential. Nobody is coming. So my views about affirmative action have evolved, obviously, over time. I used to be one of those people who said, oh, no, it was just racial discrimination, it was just reverse discrimination, and we shouldn't do it. And then I became one of those people who said, oh, no, wait a minute. I do think we need to defend affirmative action and whatnot. And now I'm one of these people who's saying, okay, whatever. Are we ever going to get serious about the actual problem of inequality and address ourselves to it? Affirmative action doesn't take us to that point. Imagine how weak and, at the end of the day, pathetic it is to be in this position of begging not to have affirmative action taken away, throwing a tantrum not to have them take away affirmative action. We want our affirmative action. Pathetic. World's becoming a small place. There are billions of people on the planet. The internet is bringing everybody online and it's bringing everybody into the mix. We need to develop our people's potential. Now, I don't think that we can do that alone, but I don't think affirmative action is very helpful in addressing that problem. So that's where I am on that.